They just don't make them like they used to. I'm sure you heard somebody saying this when talking about cars and other things. Maybe you even think this yourself. But is it really true? Are old cars better and more reliable than new ones? Are car manufacturers using planned obsolescence to make sure that their cars start falling apart right after the warranty expires to force us to buy new cars sooner than we have to? Well, today we're going to talk about all of this and more. But before we begin talking about this important topic, I'd just like to quickly let you know that today's video has been brought to you by Atlas VPN. Now, Atlas VPN packs some really powerful features at extremely affordable prices. Now, we all know that privacy goes out the window the moment you go online. But Atlas VPN uses leading encryption standards to ensure that you can restore your privacy. But it does a lot more. Are you sick of regional restrictions on HBO, Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, BBC iPlayer, Disney Plus, and other similar services? Well, with Atlas VPN, geo-based restrictions are a thing of the past. And because you get rid of geo-based restrictions, you can also access geo-restricted websites. You can also find really nice deals for subscriptions, and you can save money on hotels and airplane tickets. But on top of all of this, Atlas VPN offers a data breach monitor feature, and this monitors the security of your email accounts to ensure that there's no data breach and to prevent hackers from taking over your online accounts. So if you want to have access to more content than ever, to restore your privacy and to improve your security, definitely check out Atlas VPN. Links are down below. Okay, now back to our topic, and I'd like to start by telling you my personal story, how I came face to face with planned obsolescence. Now, some years ago, I owned this car. It was a 2009 R56 Mini Cooper, not the S one, just the basic naturally aspirated one, but it was still a really fun car, and it was really fun to drive it through corners. I enjoyed that car. Now, when I bought it, it was still under warranty, just under 3 years old, and it had just under 50,000 kilometers on the clock. So I was driving around and I stopped to go into a supermarket and I parked the car, I left, and when I came back, I noticed a big puddle of fluid right underneath my car. And like any car guy, I had to dip my finger into the fluid to see what it is. And it was coolant. So I had the car towed into the nearest authorized service because it was still under warranty. Long story short, my thermostat housing had cracked and leaked fluid all over the floor. So when I came back to pick up the car from the repair, I was kind of curious and asked the mechanic to show me the thermostat housing because I had a lot of different cars before, but I really never replaced a thermostat housing before. It isn't really a service item. So the mechanic obliged and he showed me this, a big old chunk of plastic. I was a bit surprised because all the other thermostat housings I saw before were made from metal. I mean, I own another car. It's a 1987 Toyota MR2, so it's 34 years old. It has 250,000 kilometers on the clock, and God knows how many previous owners, so chances are high it has been clocked a few times as well. But it's on its first thermostat housing. It has never been replaced before because obviously it's made from metal. It's a nice chunky unit that lasts basically forever. So I thanked the mechanic and I drove off, and I started thinking, who in their right mind would make a thermostat housing out of plastic? I mean, it's exposed to many heat cycles and it's exposed to chemicals, so isn't it better to make it from metal to ensure that it doesn't fall apart? I mean, it's obvious. Peugeot/BMW, who designed the engine in my Mini, were saving money by making the thermostat housing out of plastic. This is a clear example of planned obsolescence, right? They're making stuff that fails, but it didn't work in my case because it had to be replaced for free under warranty. I mean, the service paid even for the towing, so they lost money in my case. Funnily enough, sometime later, I sold the car to an acquaintance, and about another 50,000 kilometers later, the thermostat housing cracked again. So it was obvious. This is clearly planned obsolescence. They just got their planned obsolescence calculations a bit wrong in my case, and it failed under warranty. But it's obvious it's an inferior part that keeps failing. So it's also pretty obvious that car manufacturers are evil and that they're, manipulating us, and they're also probably a part of the Freemasons and Illuminati world control scheme. Yeah, no. I'm sure that there's a lot of secret societies and clubs and some very influential individuals out there, but using them to explain everything is just a convenient simplification for people who don't seem to want to think rationally. So let's step back and think rationally here. What do car manufacturers do? They make cars, obviously. Why do they make cars? Well, so they could sell them for a profit. Just like any manufacturing business, shoes, pots and pans, computers, you name it, you make things so you could sell them for a profit. Profit is everything. If you don't make profit, then you go bankrupt and you cease to exist. So profit for manufacturing companies is like air for humans. Without it, you die. Now, while they have to make profit, at the same time, car manufacturers also have to abide by government rules and regulations, and to ensure their cars sell well, they also have to meet consumer expectations and needs. To give governments what they want, car manufacturers have to make their cars cleaner and safer, and to do that, they obviously need to add additional parts into their cars. To give car buyers what they want, they again have to add parts into their car, because car buyers always want the cars to be ever faster, safer, more comfortable, more attractive, more efficient, They want the cars always to be better all around. And while they're at the same time adding parts to achieve this, car manufacturers must keep costs down, because cars have to be competitively priced against all the other cars in the market. So at the same time, they're adding parts while not being able to dramatically increase the price. So this explains the plastic thermostat housing, as well as plastic intake, manifolds, plastic valve covers, plastic water pumps, plastic everything. Car manufacturers aren't doing this because they're evil. They're doing this because they have to. They have to cut costs somewhere. They're forced to do this. Well, yes, cars have become more complex over the years, and of course, being more complex, it means that they have more parts, and having more parts, of course, increases the chances of failure. But there's another thing that we have to understand, and that there's an illusion when it comes to the reliability of old cars. We have to remember that most modern cars can easily make it to 150,000 miles without major servicing or overhauls. Back in the 60s and the 70s, a car that did more than 100,000 miles was considered over the hill at the very end of its lifespan. I mean, they had 5-digit odometers that would revert back to zero when the car did over 100,000 miles. But by the 80s and 90s, technology and quality control had become so good that it made it possible for manufacturers to make some truly memorable machines that seem to just refuse to die. These cars seem to be indestructible, and even 30 and 40 years later, many of them seem to be going strong, and they're on the roads racking up miles. But we have to remember that many of these vehicles are enthusiast-owned and exceptionally well taken care of today. Whether it is vehicle rarity, vehicle value, emotional attachment, or something else, many of these cars are exceptionally well and constantly maintained to keep them roadworthy. For example, the amount of money I had to spend to make and keep my 1987 Toyota MR2 roadworthy would be completely unacceptable for a new car. Now, the most rational explanation why some cars from the 80s and 90s seem indestructible is that conditions were optimal for them to be like this. Back then, safety and emission standards weren't nearly as high as they are today, which means cars didn't have to be as complex. And as we already said, technology and quality control was more than high enough to enable manufacturers to make some really robust vehicles. But there's another key factor why some cars from this era were so good and so reliable. And that key factor is something that is readily available today, but something that wasn't nearly as powerful, accurate, or usable back in the 80s and 90s. And that something is computer simulations. So why do computer simulations even matter? Well, they matter because today they're so powerful and so easily accessible that they enable engineers to design parts that last a certain amount of time. They can simulate the number of heat cycles and duty cycles, and they can see with pretty decent accuracy when a certain car component is going to start to deteriorate in function or just completely fail. And this means that they can make car parts and components that don't last much past the average mileage covered within the warranty period of that vehicle. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, this wasn't really possible. Computer simulation did exist, but it wasn't nearly as powerful, accurate, or accessible as it is today. It was pretty time-consuming and complex, which meant that it wasn't cost-effective. So car manufacturers couldn't use it to the extent that it's being used today. And this forced them to play it safe. They obviously didn't want to risk brand image by having parts fail prematurely, so they made parts a bit more robust than they needed to be to ensure that they go the distance. So wait, does this mean that today car manufacturers are actually evil? Now that they have access to this powerful and accurate technology, they're actually using it against us. They're using planned obsolescence to ensure that their cars start falling apart right after the warranty expires. Well, let me ask you something. What do you think? Who's behind planned obsolescence? Who determines how much planned obsolescence gets put into cars? Well, the answer might surprise you, because it's you and me and all of us. It's the car buyers, because governments may set emissions and safety standards, but buyers ultimately determine what sells well. So obviously nobody can force you to buy a car, and once you do buy it, nobody can force you to sell it. This means that car buyers not only determine what sells well, they also determine how long they hold on to something. And this is very important. It's important because as a civilization, we are still at the stage where we believe that the material things someone owns can increase their status in society and their value as a human being. And this is why most car buyers replace their cars very often. For many, cars aren't just a utensil, they're an instrument of joy, a way to impress peers. And obviously car manufacturers know this, and warranty periods aren't made based on some arbitrary rule. They're made based on the average number of years the average person holds onto a car. And what's interesting is that we can't be swayed by extended warranty periods. When Kia introduced their 7-year warranty, they didn't suddenly become the best-selling car brand in the world. Many people continued to buy cars with 3 and 2 years warranty, despite the fact that these cars aren't more affordable than Kia cars. And this means that the planned obsolescence that car manufacturers are doing actually makes perfect sense. Let's remember, car manufacturers are profit-driven, and that's okay, so is everybody else. That's how our world works at this time. Now, car manufacturers are only responsible and legally required to fix the car during the warranty period. They also only make money from the first sale. This means that there's zero legal requirements and zero incentives for car manufacturers to make cars more durable and more reliable than they need to be. Developing car parts that are more robust than they need to be would be wasteful, because developing robust car parts requires more cost and more energy than developing car parts that are only as good as they need to be. And this brings us to the elephant in the room. Sustainability. Sustainability of the car manufacturing industry, as well as of many other manufacturing industries. Now, our society, the world we live in, is a reflection of ourselves. Humans didn't reshape the world based on some external inputs. Nobody told us what to do. We built our world based on our wants and needs. Our governments are the reflection of the human majority. Our car brands are a reflection of our wants and needs. And the problem is that the majority seems to be two-faced when it comes to sustainability. We're all talking big about sustainability nowadays, and we're all gonna go and buy that eco-friendly toothbrush, but also the next day we're gonna go out and buy a brand new car because our neighbor also bought a brand new car, and who would want to look bad next to their neighbor? Never mind the fact that our old car was totally okay and could do many more miles. And we do this with many other things. We replace many of our material possessions not when they have come at the end of their useful lifespan, but many of us very often replace them when there's a strong enough emotional incentive to do so. In other words, we replace our wardrobes, our smartphones, and our furniture not when they're old or broken, but when we think that they have gone out of fashion or when we simply get bored of them. In fact, at their disposal, car manufacturers had the technology to make a car that could be very durable, very reliable, and very, very long lasting. They could probably even make it have user repairable and user replaceable components. But apparently nobody would buy such a car. How do I know? Well, here's an example from another pretty wasteful industry. Smartphones. We replace them every year, every other year. We replace them just because we like the new phone, even though our old phone is totally okay. Now, somebody thought this was a bad idea and they wanted to give everybody an alternative. And thus, the Fairphone 2 was born. Not only is it made from fair trade materials, it also has user repairable and user replaceable components. You like a better camera that came to the market, there's no reason to get rid of the entire phone. You can replace easily just the camera on the phone. Now, from 2015 to 2019, 115,000 Fairphones were sold. Do you know how many Samsung Galaxy 6 phones were sold in the first month of the phone's release? 10 million. Much of the world around us is a reflection of the majority of us. Currently, government laws and regulations only concern themselves with vehicle emissions while the car is running, while the vehicle is on the road. There's nothing forcing car manufacturers to make cars reliable, durable, easily repairable, and thus more sustainable. This means that car manufacturers are free to make things like this. A alternator that costs a small fortune but cannot be repaired when it goes faulty. They're also free to make components that are made by fusing multiple different components into one single large component. Only one part of it fails, the other two parts work, but you have to replace the whole thing. The whole thing gets scrapped, and they can easily justify this by saying that apparently these things contribute to a 0.5% reduction in fuel consumption and emissions. Fact is that car emissions are only a fraction of our overall emissions and environmental footprint. The outbreak of the coronavirus demonstrated this very obviously. In many places around the world, people were staying at home. Nobody was driving, so the number of cars on the road was dramatically reduced. But somehow air pollution wasn't reduced that much at all. And this is because people were still alive, they hadn't disappeared. And this means that everything else was running. Power plants, factories, processing plants, everything was running and creating emissions. Recycling cars obviously consumes energy and creates emissions, and cars, just like many other things, can't be recycled 100%. Making new cars to replace the old ones also consumes energy and creates emissions. This means that recycling something that didn't need to be recycled and making new things to replace them is wasteful, no matter how you look at it. But our current government regulations only concern themselves with vehicle emissions while the vehicles are on the road. And this is why we're getting a big push for electric vehicles, because electric vehicles have zero emissions. And I get a lot of comments on my channel from people saying how electricity is the future, how electric cars can save the world, and how there's apparently this big clash between internal combustion engine cars and electric cars. And what this sort of debate is really doing is that it's drawing attention away from the important issue, from the actual problem. And that is that electric cars will really do nothing for sustainability. In fact, in the worst case scenario, they might actually make sustainability worse. Because electric cars obviously need very large battery packs, and the useful lifespan with current technology of these battery packs is around 10 years, after which they need to be recycled. At this point in time, a new battery pack is going to cost a lot more than the value of the used vehicle, which means that also that the car is going to be recycled as well, even though most of the things on it work properly. This means that electric cars, as things currently are, don't really have a hope of lasting more than 10 years. And the scary thing is that currently we are recycling only around 5% of all the electric vehicle batteries. For example, right now many countries in Europe are giving financial incentives to their citizens to purchase battery electric vehicles. Interestingly enough, if we roll back 20 years before, many countries were also giving financial incentives for the purchasing of diesel vehicles, because at that time it was thought that diesels are actually more environmentally friendly than petrol cars, because diesels have a lower CO2 output. 20 years later, the plan obviously backfired. So let's hope the same mistake isn't made twice. So let's try and wrap things up. Is planned obsolescence real? Yes. Is it evil? Not necessarily, nor are car manufacturers. Car manufacturers are profit-driven, and they must be profit-driven because that's the way our world currently works. If they're not profit-driven, then they cease to exist. And planned obsolescence is necessary because it wastes energy and it's cost ineffective to develop things that are more robust than they need to be. But the flip side of this is that recycling things sooner than they need to be recycled and making new things to replace them is also wasteful. Obviously, this is an extremely complex and very important topic, and it's impossible to sum it up in a single video. So what I really want to do is scratch the surface of this topic, or debate if you will, and I really wanted to hear your opinion on this. So what do you think? Is change on the horizon? Are we going to be more sustainable in the near future? Are electric cars going to help? Or are we doomed? And are we going to try and fix things only when the consequences become too painful? So let me know. What do you think? As always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun, useful, and maybe slightly concerning things in the future on the D4A channel.